There is beauty all around Washington State, from the coast to the Cascades and beyond. But is climate change threatening these natural wonders?
Keep swimming, guys. You're looking good.
Now, a closer look at what's happening in Puget Sound. The toll on the state's snowpack and glaciers. Wildfire worries.
They just started evacuating. We're getting the heck out of here.
Following a record season of destruction. And what could happen to farms across the state.
When you start getting near record occurrences on a regular basis, something's going on.
This is a King 5 special presentation. Beyond the Forecast, Climate Change. Now, here's your host, Chief Meteorologist Jeff Renner.
Seattle's Cary Park offers spectacular views on sunny days such as this. We often simply say, the mountain is out. This year, we could see the mountain, Mount Rainier, more often than usual. But the novelty of this year's weather went beyond more sunshine. Now, just a few blocks to the west, there's this spectacular view of the Olympic mountain range. What has been most striking about them this year is the absolute lack of snow. Even on the higher peaks, they're barren. It mirrors the record heat, low winter snowfall, and rapid spring snowmelt. In this program, we'll look at the most likely cause of those changes and what those changes may indicate about future years and the impact of those changes on us. But the story begins beyond the Olympics, out over the Pacific Ocean.
With the high temperatures.
State climatologist Nick Bond knows the story is in the numbers.
And as far as we can tell, it's as warm out there as it's ever been.
But it's the pictures that bring that story to life.
The blob is a huge patch of warmer than normal water.
And orange marks the spot.
It's centered about 1,000 miles off our coast, and so its dimensions are at least 1,000 miles on the side.
Bond's data shows how it exploded this year, 5 degrees warmer than average. January, March, April, May, and June. Results included the warmest spring and summer ever, the most massive and numerous wildfires, and very low snowpack.
This is a preview for what's going to be more common in future decades. The climate models are emphatic about making it warmer.
A new University of Washington study emphasizes our region will continue warming without the blob 4 degrees warmer than average by the 2050s. More intense winter rainfall, more flooding, more landslides, and reduced snowpack. The evidence points to people. Now, in 1900, 500,000 people lived in Washington State, releasing modest amounts of greenhouse gases. Let me represent that number. This thermal imaging camera shows that impact and how small our carbon footprint was then. Today, of course, we use and release far more energy. And multiply me by 14, and you have the equivalent of today's state population of 7 million plus, releasing far more greenhouse gases and leaving behind a much bigger carbon footprint. That's confirmed globally by stunning night satellite images, along with our expanding carbon footprint, now at historic highs. The National Academy of Sciences confirms that has led to the warmest global temperatures in at least 1,000 years. You ever seen CO2?
No.
Do you know what a greenhouse gas looks like?
No.
The invisibility of CO2, I'm breathing it out right now, may work against its sense of urgency. But like the blob this past summer, which was also invisible, its presence and its impact can be accurately measured. For every scientific paper expressing doubt, there are at least 97 supporting human-caused climate change, including papers written by oil company scientists only recently revealed. The body of research covers what have been objections. Claim: the sun is responsible for climate change. Evidence: while the atmosphere has warmed, the sun's energy output has actually decreased over the last 40 years. Claim: you have difficulty forecasting more than a few days. How can you forecast a few decades? It's like walking a dog, or they're walking you. It's difficult to anticipate each detour, the daily weather. It's much easier to figure out the trend, the climate. Claim: if we're experiencing warming, how can we have record cold in some regions? Evidence: Last winter was cold over the eastern U.S. Globally, the area impacted by warming was much bigger. Claim: temperatures have actually been cooling since the late 1990s. Evidence: 2014 was the warmest on record. This year is likely to set a new record. And finally, the whole issue has truly stirred the pot of public discussion. Before we launch into the various regional impacts, a look at the claim that it's just a theory. Now, in science, a theory is not merely a guess or an estimate. As in cooking, where you might say, I think this needs a little more seasoning. A theory in science, you see, has successfully explained a range of past observations, is well tested by independent scientists, and has correctly forecast a range of future changes. It's not simply opinion published on a website without independent review. Scientists say climate change meets that definition of a scientific theory, like gravity, and that we ignore their consensus at our peril. One such danger: increasing wildfires. My colleague Jim Guy examines that.
July 2014, the Carlton Complex Fire. It grows to become the largest single wildfire in state history.
Just a deafening roar, and the wind was so strong that you couldn't run fast enough.
Over 400 square miles burned. That's 4 times the size of Seattle. Over 250 homes lost.
What do you say?
Fast forward to this year. In August, the Okanagan Complex Fire. 5 fires burning all at once burn over 400 square miles.
I see flames moving really fast. We're worried about the patch of pines that are over there.
The cost to fight this complex of fires? Over $44 million. Tragically, 3 firefighters die while fighting the flames.
We've certainly seen an increase in large fires and the amount of area burned in the Northwest over the past 30 years or so.
University of Idaho Associate Professor John Abatsoglu has made a study of climate change and the effect it's having on wildfires across the region.
I think if you look at the last 10 or 15 summers, they have been unlike any other 10 or 15 summers in terms of temperature that we've seen in 120 years for the region at large.
Abatsoglu says that with climate change and warmer temperatures, we're expecting drier conditions in the summer months and a longer fire season, and that leads to higher fire danger. In fact, John says that from a climate perspective, we can expect a 3- to 4-fold increase in the occurrence of these large wildfires in years to come. So in the future, how can firefighters better control and fight these large wildfires? Well, the answer may be in the sky. These drones, made by a company here in Washington, may be a low-cost way to give firefighters real-time data. They can help locate hot spots using an infrared camera. They may be able to fly at night or when low visibility keeps piloted aircraft on the ground.
They will, but it's like a lot of things. You've got to try it on a pilot basis, work it out so that your commanders are actually comfortable with it and can see the value of it before you really start using it at a large landscape level.
A week-long test this past summer went very well and could lead to more flights in the future.
You'll find wonderful produce here at the Pike Place Market, but producing spectacular fruits and vegetables such as this demands the right mix of sunshine, warmth, and water. Now, Northwest farmers have faced extreme heat and record drought in the last year, and they're wondering if that could be the new normal. How they're preparing for that possibility, Allison Murrow reports.
They call this a pumpkin graveyard. The floodwaters that killed them have dropped and frozen over, but not before littering bright orange for hundreds of yards across roads, even depositing them in trees. Eric Fritsch was more concerned about his cattle, worried they'd end up like their hay bales carried by floodwaters to neighboring properties.
They trust you to take care of them, and we have our responsibilities.
The Skykomish River's peak set a record in November. Cattle huddled together as waters rose 3 feet higher than predicted.
At that point, there was really nothing I could do about it. I couldn't get in here because it would have taken a boat. It would have been too dangerous in the currents.
Everyone survived. It was the 3rd flood for Fritsch's farm in several weeks. A farm with all kinds of hungry mouths to feed. all of whom didn't just survive floods, they'd also just survived a drought.
We went from irrigating as late as mid-September to having floodwaters 6 weeks later.
And for the first time Fritch can remember, he started irrigating as early as May. Weather change that changed business too.
So you can see in the bark of the log the char that's left after the fire.
Fritch isn't just a farmer, he owns a timber mill.
The ponderosa pine has been dead for a while.
This wood is from wildfires over a year ago.
The highs get higher and the lows get lower.
Fritch says he's not sure the change is permanent, but he does know he can't wait to find out. All of these crops were destroyed in the floods. To save his cattle from the same fate, Fritch plans to rent land and move them to higher ground.
I mean, they are farm animals, but they're still pretty important to us.
In Snohomish County, Allison Murrow.
Aren't you, girl?
King 5 News.
Any last words?
Well, there's an optimistic fellow.
Up next, take a plunge into Puget Sound. See the effects of climate change along the sea floor and what it means for the underwater ecosystem.
I'm standing in Woods Creek just outside Murrow. During these autumn months, the best color isn't in the trees lining the banks, it's here in the river. I'm speaking of salmon. It's now late autumn, and color in both leaves and salmon are fading. Some fish have completed their long journey from the ocean, but others continue to muscle upstream in a bruising battle against gravity, water, and time.
Nice little stretch here.
Tom Quinn has studied the king of fish for more than 3 decades.
It's a really nice set of rocks. I mean, it's just perfect for digging a nest.
But good habitat demands more than good gravel.
As the stream gets shallower, it gains and loses heat faster during the day than a deeper stream.
Temperature and river depth vary by month and exact location.
This year in the Columbia River, of course, the water was very, very warm, and so you'd see females, unlike this, that would have swollen bellies, full of eggs because they just ran out of energy and didn't complete their spawning.
Such stories concern biologists, commercial and sport fishers, and consumers.
We don't necessarily have to project into the future saying how much hotter it's going to be. The question is, will it just be that hot more often?
Such stresses could reduce the number of salmon migrating here through Puget Sound next year, and future generations could encounter vastly different ocean conditions. Changes beyond river depth, sea level rise, and shoreline erosion are already evident. Those changes are the focus of this Seattle Aquarium dive team.
Full face mask.
I joined them this past October.
What a rock bottom is today, 1,000.
Underwater, Puget Sound is a twilight world, where light and colors fade rapidly with depth.
I copy you.
The health of these cold waters supports ours. We don't have to descend far to see the first problem: warming water.
We do see spikes in the temperature. This year, recently, we have more of a plateau. It came up really high early and stayed that way for a prolonged period of time.
Right now you can see these small objects drifting past my faceplate. These are plankton. They're very tiny, but they're the basis of the food chain of what keeps Puget Sound healthy.
We descend to the bottom for evidence of breaks in that food chain. That includes massive die-offs or wasting of colorful sea stars. One healthy and one not.
The change in pH could change the calcium that's in the water that is readily available for the animals, or the high range of temperatures for a prolonged period of time could add to that stress.
And such stresses may amplify or speed the disease process. Answering that question demands coordinated field and lab work. We use what's called a Niskin bottle.
It makes a watertight seal on both ends. They can retrieve it, take it up to the surface, and then test for all the water quality at that specific depth. Sending down the messenger. All right, pull up.
Next, some answers.
These are the pteropods that were actually collected in the Puget Sound.
This sample was collected not far from our dive site.
Pteropods actually provide food for a lot of different species, including salmon.
Dr. Nina Bednarsik is examining changes in water quality related to ocean acidification and the impact of those changes on marine life.
They have these tiny shells that start to dissolve under increasing corrosive conditions, so they're really an indicator for ocean acidification.
Pteropods are smaller than a pencil eraser. A light microscope reveals shell corrosion, the result of increasing carbon dioxide in the water. A healthy pteropod is a vigorous swimmer. One with a dissolved shell barely moves. It's more vulnerable. An electron microscope shows large pits, even holes in the shell.
Puget Sound is indeed one of the areas where we see the most severe dissolution, and that's quite disconcerting because I haven't seen that level of dissolution anywhere else in the world.
The seafood industry depends upon water, and plenty of it. And of course, our water supply depends upon snow. Coming up, the future of snow here in the Pacific Northwest. Stores such as REI that specialize in ski and snowboard gear are hoping, they're planning for a better winter this season. Our mountains, the snow, the glaciers, and the water they supply define the Pacific Northwest. But climate change is altering our landscape. My colleague Rich Marriott tells us what the future may hold.
Washington has the largest number of glaciers in the lower 48 states. But as the climate changes, those glaciers are shrinking and in many cases disappearing altogether. An inventory of glaciers in the Olympic Mountains in 1980 found 266 glaciers. 30 years later, 82 of those glaciers had completely disappeared and the rest had shrunk. Similar loss has been measured in the Cascades, where the South Cascade Glacier lost 22% of its ice between 1958 and 1998. I've seen this change myself. When I worked at the Blue Glacier Research Station in the Olympics for the University of Washington 30 years ago, I was measuring the mass balance, basically the health of the glacier. It was stable then. But 3 years ago, I visited the Blue and saw 3 decades of ice loss. Back in the early 80s, it used to extend down past that rock outcrop. 30 years later, it had retreated above the rock and also thinned significantly. But the shrinking and loss of glaciers has more than a visual impact. Although glacial melt only provides a small percentage of the water for Northwest rivers, it provides it at a critical time of year when rivers are warming and flows are at their lowest. Glacial melt helps maintain river levels and cooler water temperatures for fish. It provides water necessary for hydroelectric generation. Over the next 25 years, the changing climate and the loss of glacial meltwater in the summer may have a substantial impact on our region. In the past, only spotty measurements of the mass change on a few glaciers has been possible. However, David Shin at the University of Washington is using high tech to measure these changes in detail over a broader area.
We're using a combination of satellite, ground-based measurements, airborne measurements, basically any way we can to measure what the surface elevation is of these glaciers.
This data is run through a special program on supercomputers at NASA calculating the glacial contribution to our Northwest rivers every year.
The beauty of this technique is we're doing this for the entire Northwest. It's not just for one location.
And having that information for the entire region is vital to being prepared for our future in a changing climate.
Hopefully the decisions about climate, the environment, and the poor are going to start being made well, because they're very urgent.
From science to religion, Jeff visits the Vatican to talk with church experts about climate change and the future.
The discussion on climate change has focused on 3 questions: science, politics, and economics. But recently it expanded to include a 4th, faith. That's what brought me here to Rome, to the Vatican, to St. Peter's Square, Piazza San Pietro. The architect Bernini designed it as a transition from earth to the divine. The colonnades in twin arcs welcoming arms. The basilica representing the mountain of God. Moving us emotionally from our time to eternity and to the roots of faith. The basilica testifies to the sacrifice of Jesus and the apostles. St. Peter was crucified here, upside down. Peter's successor, Pope Francis, is seeking to literally upend attitudes toward climate change by writing this new book called an encyclical, Laudato Si. The Pope has repeatedly emphasized the environmental crisis represents a crisis of faith and reverence.
Laudato Si.
The words mean, praise be to you. The letter released this past May emphasizes the problems and the need for action extend far beyond current generations. While visiting Rome earlier this year, I had the opportunity to speak with Father Michael Czerny. He led the team that composed the first draft and offered insights on its motivation.
One is the scientific evidence, and the other is the experience and the suffering of the poor. And looked at from these two complementary angles, climate change is on the agenda.
On the assertion that humans have a right to use the Earth's resources however they wish.
And God doesn't exercise dominion rapaciously or irresponsibly. In fact, he does it very lovingly. And so it's a mistake to use the word dominion as a justification for the uncontrolled or the unmeasured exploitation of resources.
On the issue of waste and overconsumption.
When it becomes a kind of tranquilizer or antidote to unhappiness, then again it's not serving its real purpose.
On criticism by some that the Pope, a trained chemist, should be silent on climate change issues.
There where important decisions are made, that is where one's faith, one's values, one's character, one's vocation, one's destiny are played out. I think that's a pretty good definition of religion, and I think that's where religion has its contribution to make.
Other churches, other faiths, have expressed similar perspectives and concerns. Each has emphasized consideration of climate change and the impact of our decisions on future generations, pointing out that perhaps the biggest challenge we must master is not a changing climate, but ourselves. I'm Jeff Renner. Thanks for joining us.